Okay, hello and welcome to the January edition of the CaTS monthly webinar. This is David Alexander from Cyber Infrastructure Enhancement. And with me also from Cyber Infrastructure Enhancement is Connie Merla. And a special guest this month with us is Leigh Lamonica from the Ethics and Regulatory Core. Something we're going to try here in 2019 is to invite other cores in the CaTS to come and do presentations to share more information via this webinar. And Leigh has been kind enough to join us this month with a great title, There's Nothing Common About the New Common Rule. So that being said, I'm going to go on ahead and hand the mic over to Leigh, who'll take us through this. And if you have any questions today, just go ahead and use the chat window and we will handle those at the end, unless they're pressing, then we'll do them in flight. So go ahead and enjoy, and I'm going to hand this over to Leigh.
Thank you, David.
Great.
So I'm going to talk about the new common rule, which went into effect on January 21st of this year. We're going to talk about some of the highlights, the main points of the changes to the new common rule, which are some definition changes, some exemption category revisions, some new consent template requirements, and some improvements to the continuing review process, which means it's eliminated for some research. So the common rule applies to all DHHS supported activities. As I mentioned, it went into effect January 21st. Please remember when you look at the new rules that all the other rules that apply to research still apply. The HIPAA privacy rule, security rule, breach notification rule, the FDA rules, and the institutional rules. So one of the big changes for the new common rule is the definition of human subjects. This revision adds references to information and biospecimens. Biospecimens was previously not addressed in the common rule definition of human subject, and that has been added to address the increased use of biospecimens in human subjects research. Also clarifying what is not research in the new common rule. Scholarly journal activities and public health surveillance activities are no longer considered research. However, you're going to want to be sure that you get a not for human subjects research determination by the IRB, because many journals will not publish your publication if you do not have that documentation. So now we're going to look at changes in the exemptions. As a review, these are the levels of IRB review. You have the full board review, which is greater than minimal risk, and the full IRB reviews that protocol. You have expedited review, which is minimal risk, which is either reviewed by the IRB chair or a designee from the IRB. And then you have exempt studies, which are not greater than minimal risk, which is also reviewed by the IRB chair or the designee. So one of the main changes was the exempt category changes. Exempt research are projects that meet specific criteria. Although the IRB may determine that a project is exempt from the full-scale IRB review, it still needs this determination by the IRB. Also keep in mind that while it may be exempt research from the IRB perspective, the HIPAA privacy rules still apply. The exemption categories. There have been two new categories added to the exemption categories. Exemption 1 really applies to research that's commonly done in educational surroundings. One of the new restrictions is that it must not adversely impact the student's opportunity to gain information, meaning that if it's part of a course curriculum, the same course curriculum information would have to be conveyed, even if the research wasn't going on or whether it is going on. Exemption 2 revolves around educational tests, surveys, interviews that are not interventions. It's only those interactions and not interventions. The research must not be reasonably be damaging to the subject's educational advancement, very similar to Exemption 1. There is identifiable information included. It's recorded, and there must be adequate privacy protections in place. And then this particular exemption does not apply to projects where there's the collection of biospecimens or children in most circumstances. Exemption category 3 is new. It involves the benign behavioral interventions where there is a collection of information from an adult, either through verbal or written responses, or if, say for a focus group, you have audio recordings and the subject prospectively agrees to be recorded either audio or visual for that intervention. Those types of research protocols would fall under exempt category 3. Exemption 4 is is revised, and it applies to secondary research for identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. Category 4 does not require informed consent if at least one of the following criteria below is met. It's use of public available identifiable biospecimens or identifiable biospecimens. Information is recorded by the investigator in such a way that the identity of the subject can't be readily ascertained, or there's no attempt that they will try and recontact the subject. The research use of identifiable health information is regulated by HIPAA, or the analysis of data is on behalf of the federal agency or department. So what's new? No longer limited to retrospective data review, and it permits the secondary use of identifiable PHI with a HIPAA authorization or waiver. Exempt category 5 expands to include research supported by a federal department or agency. You must have that department's agency head approval, and it's primarily for research protocols that have a public benefit or a public service program element. Exempt category 6, there's really no change with this category. Category 6 involves taste and food quality studies. It is permitted with wholesome foods without additives when they're consumed, foods that contain food ingredients or below the level that are used for generally regarded as safe, so GRAS materials that might not be considered a food or is a food combined with other materials that would label that product GRAS. So exemption categories 7 and 8 applies to the storage and maintenance of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens for secondary research for which broad consent is required, and we'll talk about broad consent a little more in a minute. Exemption 8 talks about applies to secondary research involving the use of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, which broad consent was obtained as well. So what is broad consent? Broad consent is a utilization that is determined by each individual institution depending on several factors. Broad consent was implemented by OHRP to gain just what it says, a broad consent from an individual to do certain things with their biospecimens and information. However, there's been very little guidance on the broad consent implementation. So certain institutions may not be implementing it based on that they want to hold off until that guidance is issued. So please contact your IRB office to determine if your institution is utilizing this mechanism, and if so, how the categories 7 and 8 will be implemented. Informed consent. So under the old rule, there were 8 basic elements and then 6 additional elements if they were required. So under the new rule, there is new information about how the consent form is presented. We've added an additional basic element regarding private identifiable information or identifiable biospecimens, and then 3 new additional elements. So in the presentation area, the consent form must be provided with information that a reasonable person would need in order to make an informed decision about whether to participate or not in the study. This is the reasonable person standard. This is very common standard to use. As part of that standard, you're going to provide the participant with a key information at the start of the informed consent. And in that key information section, you're going to highlight the reasons why one might or might not want to participate in the research. It's got to be, it can't be a list of reasons. It's got to be organized and presented in a way that facilitates comprehension. As I mentioned, it should not be presented as just a list of isolated facts, but as a whole of reasoning of why you would or would not want to participate in a trial. So the new basic element is regarding the identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. As part of the informed consent document, the researcher must now include one of the following statements: that the information collected may be used for future research or distributed to others without further consent after the identifiers have been removed, if this is a possibility, or that the information will not be used for future research even if the identifiers are removed. This should be thought about carefully when you're developing your protocol, because this will control what you can do with that information for the entire life of the study and afterwards. So the new additional elements of consent, that the subject's biospecimens may be used for commercial profit, or if they are going to be used for commercial profit, whether the subject will or will not share in this commercial profit. Also, whether clinically relevant research results, including individual results, will be disclosed to the subjects, and if so, under what conditions. And when research includes biospecimens, whether the research, if it's known at the time, will include whole genomic sequencing. And if so, you must disclose that at the time of the consent. So waiver of informed consent also has some new criteria. As you've seen a pattern that the regulations are addressing identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, this is also an element that they've added for the waiver of informed consent, that if you have those two, or if you have those two items involved in your research, that the research could not practically be carried out without such information in an identifiable format, and why, and therefore that would come into play about whether the IRB is going to give you a waiver of informed consent. Changes to the continuing review process. So under the new common rule, there are exceptions to these requirements. These exceptions only apply to studies approved on or after January 21st. For exempt studies, the new studies will not have continuing review requirements required. For expedited studies, there are no longer continuing review requirements. Full board, however, continuing review requirements still apply, at least annually, until the study status has progressed to data analysis or acquisition of long-term follow-up data. Individual institutions may still have check-in or status update procedures similar to continuing reviews, so you need to check with your individual institution on how that process will occur. The FDA regulated research doesn't fall under the common rule, but so it must still have a continuing review at least on an annual basis. The consent form templates, however, need to incorporate both the institutional and federal requirements. So the FDA studies will also have that key information section. As a reminder, this comes up when you don't have continuing review. The PI and the study team need to remember that modifications for study changes still need to be submitted to the IRB, report events and unanticipated problems must still occur, and then close the study once it ends or when personal identifiers are removed from the information and all the codes are destroyed. So here's some miscellaneous changes. This is a big one for a lot of people, that clinical trials supported with federal funds, that the informed consent document must be posted on a federal website that will be established as a repository for ICF. The posting of the ICF must occur after the clinical trial is closed for recruitment and no later than 60 days after the last study visit by any subject. And note that the definition of clinical trial has recently been expanded, so you may want to go back and check and see if this applies. Transition for ongoing research. Each institution is handling the transition under the old rule or to the new rule individually, so you'll need to consider what they're doing, your individual institution is doing, before making any type of decision about your research. It is up to the individual institution who has oversight for the research study to determine whether or not studies are transitioning. And as I mentioned, everybody is handling this a little differently, so contact your IRB office. Things to consider if you have the choice to whether to transition your research or not, is that researchers can't pick and choose between the two sets of regulations for one study. If you transition to the new common rule, the study must satisfy all of the criteria under the regulations. This transition is permanent, so if you decide you don't like the new rules, then you can't go back. Note that transition isn't required, so you can keep your study under the old regulations. So if you have a transition study or a study that you may be considering to transition, it's approved prior to 1/21/19. You can transition it after. If you do, all of the parts of the new common rule apply. If you don't, the old common rule still applies. So it's a balancing. You get the benefit of not having to submit continuing review, which is a plus to many investigators, but your consent documents will have to be revised and you will have to post consent documents publicly. And that is a wrap for the highlights of the new IRB Common Rule and regulations. Are there any questions?
Leigh, that was a lot of content. I have a question for you.
Sure.
So you mentioned that an awardee is responsible for posting to a public website. Is that facility available now?
Yes, you can post to clinicaltrials.gov,
Oh, okay.
or there is a new website called regulations.gov where you can also post your informed consent document. And while not part of the new IRB rules, in clinicaltrials.gov, enforcement is increasing. So therefore, you're going to want to make sure that all of the submissions to clinicaltrials.gov are also part of your review process when you're submitting a new protocol.
Okay, well, thanks, Leigh. Again, that was great. And if you have other questions for Leigh, here on this final question slide, I've got the info@lecats.org email address and also the redcap@lecats.org email address. So if you have questions about Leigh's presentation or about REDCap in general, please use those email addresses to get us questions. And then just as a general pitch, what do you want to see in this webinar? Like I said at the opening, in 2019, we're going to be involving more KCAs and covering more topics. So I have a number of topics lined up. I won't give anything away because we're still in the planning stages, but good stuff's going to be coming in the next few months. But if you'd like to rate today's webinar, please go to lacats.org/redcapfeedback. Actually, we have a different. It says RedCap feedback. That's the link that works, but we'll be changing that as well. But for now, use that link. Give us feedback today on Leigh's presentation and things you want to see in the future. All the webinars that we've done so far for LaCats can be found by visiting lacats.org/YouTube. That's our YouTube channel, and we'd appreciate if you'd subscribe to that channel as well. And if we don't have any other announcements for today, Connie, no? Leigh?
No.
Okay, great. Well, then that's a wrap. And look for more information regarding our February webinar, and we will see you then. Thanks again. Bye.